Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of my talk on the Phaedo. Again, please send your Q&A questions to mariacipriani@hofstra.edu. So imagine that your most favorite person in the world will die today, and you get to spend that last day with that person. How would you feel? Some people would prefer not to know that it's the person's last day. Others would find it a blessing to be able to sit with the person and say everything they need to say before the final goodbye. That is the scenario of the Phaedo, the crisis, if you will. The response to that crisis is the entirety of the dialogue, it seems. How Socrates approaches his death, how his friends who are bereft nevertheless persevere in asking their questions and engaging in the question and answer that was Socrates' method of teaching. In the Apology, we saw Socrates, who the oracle of Delphi proclaimed was the wisest person in Athens, failed to defend himself and win an acquittal against the charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. In the Phaedo, which I am thinking of as a sequel to the Apology, Phaedo tells about how Socrates spent his last day with his friends, encouraging them to ask any questions or challenge him in any way that they can, because there will be literally no tomorrow for them to come back and ask or continue the conversation. The way this dialogue is set up, Phaedo is returning home at some undisclosed time after Socrates' execution. On his journey home, he meets a group of Pythagoreans in southern Italy, and he gives them an account of that fateful day. So there are two levels of dialogue here. First is Phaedo talking to the Pythagoreans, and second is within Phaedo's narrative of what he saw and experienced in the prison on that day. This is a Platonic dialogue, but Plato is not present. He's not included except as a passing reference. Phaedo notes that Plato was not there. He was neither in the prison, nor is he at Phaedo's telling of the event to the Pythagoreans. So I found myself wondering about the question, how did Plato come to write this dialogue? Clearly, at least to me, the Phaedo is a text that honors a beloved teacher and puts him in the best possible light. As much the gadfly that Socrates was in court, in the Phaedo, Socrates is a patient and encouraging teacher who laughs gently when questioned and comforts his students and friends as he accepts his punishment. Phaedo describes Socrates as kindly encouraging Simmias and Cebes to keep questioning until they're satisfied with the answers that they have arrived at. He fondly plays with Phaedo's hair at one point as the narrator sits at the feet of his teacher in the prison. Socrates is also shown as being kind to his wife and children, to the jailer, and even, according to his reported last words, concerned for his neighbors and making sure that all his debts are paid. So originally, this dialogue was called On the Soul, and in the dialogue we find Socrates' beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the god or gods. The big question, what happens when we die, is the focus of much of this dialogue, as inevitably, at the end of the day, Socrates is going to find out. The gallows humor that Socrates uses, inviting Simmias and Cebes in essence to speak now or forever hold your peace, encourages them to resist his arguments until they're fully satisfied with the results. This method of teaching by asking a series of questions is what's called the Socratic method. And while it seems to come naturally for Socrates, for others it's not an easy practice to be able to lead students through a series of questions and come to their own answer, rather than asking them to read a book and ask the teachers questions, as I usually do when I'm teaching. So reading this dialogue and following the series of questions to me was like reading The Art of Rhetoric in practice. But here's a 21st century question. Is this method manipulative? I don't know the answer. It's a rhetorical question. But it did occur to me as I was reading the text. One has a tendency to read from one's own point of view. My purpose in rehearsing the history of this classical text before reading it was to remind myself to try and situate my reading in the mind of the text and away from my own smartphone-driven, busy modern world perspective, as well as away from my own personal internal beliefs about the soul, about my own life, and my own eventual death, in order to fully appreciate what Socrates is presenting. In his arguments, Socrates talks about the forms, seemingly with a capital F. As I understand it, the Platonic idea of the forms, presumably taken from Socrates, is that for everything that exists in this imperfect life, there is a perfect template of it, a template of it in its perfect form. We, and other things in life, make the asymptotic ascent toward that perfection. You remember asymptotes from calculus or algebra, right? We, particularly if we are philosophers, who are literally lovers of knowledge, come closer and closer to that perfection, which we can never really reach. Thus, when Socrates talks about the forms, those forms may be thought of as the perfect template, while everything here on earth, in a less than perfect existence, are instances of those templates. For example, that striking red maple that was behind me in my introduction is not the most perfectly beautiful maple, and it's not the most perfectly red, but it strives to achieve that perfection. Socrates may have had the distinction of being the most wise man in Athens. He cannot be the most perfectly wise human being ever. That is never really achievable. I find myself wondering as I read whether the soul itself has a perfect template in the realm of the forms. This idea of the forms is where the original idea of Platonic love comes from. The Platonic love is the highest form of love for Platonists. However, Platonic love is something that, for most of us in 2020, we understand it as the friend zone, which is not necessarily the highest form of love. But this shows how values and understandings have changed over the course of a few millennia. Another thing that was interesting to me as I read, and as someone who has studied children's and young adult literature, is the idea presented by Socrates that learning is not writing on a blank slate, which is the metaphor that many of us use thanks to the 18th century Romantic movement. Instead, for Socrates, learning is a remembering of what we already know. The idea that we are remembering what we already knew, rather than being newly impressed with knowledge by a teacher or teachers, might be the difference between being able to easily teach by Socratic method rather than professing. One argument that Socrates puts forth hinges on opposites: oddness and evenness, hot and cold, large and small, visible and invisible, alive and dead. As a person living in 2020, it's difficult for me to read without objection line 71c, in which Phaedo reports that Socrates parallels the opposites of wakefulness and sleeping with being alive and being dead. Okay, I can see that, but when he says, therefore, if these are opposites, they come to be from one another, and there are two processes of generation between the two, I'm not so quick to say, of course. And then again in 72a when he says, therefore, if there's such a thing as coming to life again, it would be a process of coming from the dead to the living. I cannot, from a 2020 perspective, easily see it. This difference in cosmology leads me to be unconvinced about the afterlife of the soul. But again, that is from a 2020 perspective, which may be polluted, to use Socrates' translated word, by our technologies and understanding. The intellectual objections that I have to this discussion are subsumed by the moving and dramatic description that follows once Simmias and Cebes' objections have been satisfied. Socrates takes the poison. He says goodbye to his weeping friends and family. And finally, he ceases to speak. The response to the crisis of Socrates' death was different for those losing Socrates, they were bereft, than for Socrates himself. He seemed curious and unafraid. As Phaedo tells it, he was truly living his philosophy. In this presentation, I've talked about the setting, the prison, on Socrates' last day. The main players in this dialogue, who were Socrates, Phaedo, Simmias, Cebes, as well as others of Socrates' students and acquaintances who were in attendance. We touched briefly on the Socratic method of teaching and also on the idea of the Platonic forms that Socrates Plato uses in his arguments. I've deliberately not discussed the substance and trajectory of Socrates' arguments. I will leave that to the philosophers. In the meantime, please send questions to me at maria.cipriani@hofstra.edu. If I can't get to them in the Q&A, I will certainly respond to your email. But for now, I will see you in part 3.